Hi folks, today we're speaking with Leon Gettler. Now Leon is the author of a book called An Unpromised Land. It's going to be available on, it is now available on Audible, on iTunes, and at this stage about 8 or 9 other bookstores and online libraries. Leon, thanks for joining me today. And look, I was wondering if you'd like to start by perhaps just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Myself, well, I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist now for more years than I care to remember, about 40 years. And I've covered everything from politics to business and economics to foreign affairs. I've worked overseas. I've done everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, but many years ago, it was about 25, maybe 30 years ago.
Okay.
I came across this amazing story of an attempt to set up a settlement of refugees in the Kimberleys in Northern Australia during the Second World War.
Well, that's completely uncharted land. I mean,
totally.
It's barren. The local Aborigines would have had a presence there, but I think it's pretty hard country.
It is a very hard country. Now, this information came to me in the late 80s, so this was before immigration was that big an issue in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So I started doing research and I went through government archives, tracked down people who were involved in the scheme, got lots of photos, lots of images, lots of interviews, lots of material from newspapers, government archives, interviews, and pieced it all together as this extraordinary story.
So this is the investigative journalist coming out, and
That's right.
Like handy skills for the research for this project.
That's right, and it becomes a wonderful narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was a meeting of the exotic and the laconic because the scheme was promoted in Australia by a chap called Dr. Isaac Steinberg. Now, Dr. Steinberg happened to be the first Attorney General for Lenin after the Russian Revolution. He was a social revolutionary.
So this is 1916?
The Russian Revolution was 1917. He was a social revolutionary. He had been exiled from Russia for revolutionary activities, where he got his doctorate of law at Heidelberg University, came back to Russia, was active in the revolutionary movement, and the social revolutionaries had a coalition with the Bolsheviks.
Mm-hmm.
So he was chosen as the Attorney General.
I see.
But he was an extraordinary man. He was an Orthodox religious Jew, but also being a social revolutionary with the Bolsheviks, and he was quite left-wing.
You sound surprised. Is that unusual to find one person embodied with those two?
That's right.
Are they opposing viewpoints, do you think?
No, not necessarily.
Just unusual to see them
together. And he spoke many languages,
mm-hmm.
something like 7 languages, and as it turned out, the social revolutionaries fell out with the Bolsheviks. He was exiled from Russia, ended up in London, where he became involved with a group called the Freeland League for Jewish Territorial Colonisation.
I see.
And at that stage,
what sort of time frame are we talking?
This is
now?
the 1930s. This is now the 1930s.
Uh-huh.
So you've got the growth now of, Hitler has come to power. And you've got the growth of anti-Semitism in Germany and throughout Europe at that time. Now,
these were tough times worldwide. These were tough times. This was pretty much a global recession through the late 20s, leading into the 30s.
That's right.
And that kind of dovetailed with Hitler's rise through the whole thing, because I guess when people are desperate, they do unusual and outrageously barbaric things as well. But
what happened then was that the bottom had fallen out of the beef market in Australia, in the Kimberleys, and the beef market was pioneered by the Durack family in the Kimberleys.
Mm-hmm.
And the Freeland League struck a deal with the Duracs to lease that part of their holdings from them, and they would set up a settlement. So they had the Duracs on side.
How interesting. And are we talking about 200 or 300 hectares, or
we're talking an area the size of Belgium.
Right.
And
okay.
so, big area.
Yep.
And for about 75,000 refugees. And the plan was that they would come out there to this wilderness and they would set up farms and industries. And
Leon, in my own research, just while we've been doing the audiobook together, I mean, I suppose if we can include immigration along with with economics, because there's kind of a tie between the whole things. But I'm curious about the fact that that we are talking about an area of the Kimberley which has probably 2 or 3 large freshwater rivers running through it,
like the Ord.
Like the Ord River, yes, and I think there's the Victoria up there.
The Victoria River.
And would it have gone as far south as the Fitzroy River?
It would have stretched down that far.
Probably went down that far. So these are major inland.
These are major
freshwater inland.
Freshwater.
And that's your first requirement for settlement anyway.
That's right.
Really, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. So they were actually proposing the forerunner of the Ord River scheme. And what they were proposing,
which wasn't all that successful in its first tryout many years later.
But think about what the settlers in Israel did many years later with the wilderness out there.
So this is what qualifies these people to give it a fighting chance out in Australia. And conditions were not dissimilar to Palestine, would you say?
No, not at all.
Okay.
So Steinberg came to Australia. He went and saw the West Australian Premier, John Wilcock. Mm-hmm. John Wilcock said, "Oh, okay, yeah, well, go and investigate." So he took out a scientist to the area with the Duracs, and they came back with a fantastic report. It got the support of the West Australian government straight away. It had the support of the ACTU because Steinberg had a left-wing background, and this was part of their fight against fascist ferocity.
Yes, so that's the social democracy side.
That's right.
Steinberg,
and it had the support of the church, all the churches, Protestant, Catholic, all the churches would.
Why do you think the churches were so on board?
Because it was Christian.
Regardless
it was
of
a
faith?
Christian thing to do to save refugees.
You would hope that this runs true through all religions.
That's right.
That love of your fellow man.
That's right.
Is something that runs through.
That's right. But the problem was that it meant the federal government had a policy against mass settlements of immigrants, particularly non-British immigrants.
Right.
And so Steinberg went and saw the government, and at that stage, the war broke out.
Right.
And so
where are we now?
1939. After September 1939, the war's breaking out. The government now for the government, this was a really interesting proposition because here was a proposition to populate the north, which was vulnerable to a takeover, to an invasion from the Yellow Peril.
Well, when you think about it, in that top northwestern part of Australia, we're very close to Indonesia. We're very close to Asia.
That's right.
Yep.
So you had to populate or perish.
Populate or perish.
And so that was and also the other advantage was it came at no cost to the taxpayer. On the other hand, it meant overturning traditional government policies. Which
I think the one that comes to mind here, Leon, is the White Australia policy.
The White Australia policy.
Right.
And so this was an enormous issue. Now, in my research, I followed the public debate of it. Now, all of this was happening at a time before social media. So the way I was gauging public opinion was I went through all the letters pages in every newspaper.
Right.
And believe me, the letters pages were filled with people with opinion of it, for or against. It was a passionate argument. You had editorials on it.
Isn't that fantastic?
And it was just extraordinary.
Yeah.
And so, in the end, the government sat on its hands for 5 years and in the end decided not to go ahead with it.
Right.
But
this is the federal government, of course.
the Commonwealth government, yes. Yeah. But this was, by that stage, it was the Curtin government.
Okay.
And I would say, though, that the debate about this scheme paved the way for the post-war migration boom.
Interesting.
So after the war, Australia started letting in non-British migrants. So you had Greeks and Italians and Turks and Balts coming in, not just Jews, Poles, Hungarians, people from all over Europe. They were non-British for the first time. Now, I would say the debate about this scheme, which was very much in the public eye at that time, was the forerunner for that scheme. So the Kimberley scheme never actually got up, but it's an important part of the Australian story.
It's a stepping stone.
That's right.
Yeah. How interesting. That's a really interesting point of view. And I think...
and it helped change Australia.
Yes, look, absolutely, indeed. That I guess... The real change I imagine that it may have generated was a change in mindset, but no doubt there was some pretty savvy economic reasoning underneath all of this as well. In Australia, there was a shortage of skilled labour, so people who had skills in textiles, in clothing and manufacturing, small goods, all sorts of
machinery,
food industries,
all of that.
That was what Australia was actually giving up with its earlier restrictive policies around
That's right.
migration. On the one hand, we want everybody to be of a certain extraction. So we actually wanted to define what an Australian is, and you'll fall within these particular parameters. But they were bleeding out the other side of it, of course, because they weren't developing manufacturing industries and the economy wasn't growing.
And I think this book is important in the context of the debate we're now having about immigration.
Yes.
And so I think that's what makes this book so fascinating. And it's an important part of Australian history. And a part of Australian history that no one knows anything about. I'm now the global authority on this scene.
Well, you've certainly done your research.
I know it. Yeah. So, and, it took a lot of work. And the book, when it came out, the book originally came out in 1993. It won a National Book Council Award.
Okay.
So this book, we're now on Audible, is the second edition. And it's been rewritten and updated.
Fantastic. I believe you rewrote an introduction especially for the second edition.
I did.
Too. And quite a lovely addition to the audio version, if I might say.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So that's something that people can keep their ears open for around social media when we're promoting the book. And you can have a 17-minute snapshot as to what you might expect to listen to in the storytelling.
I really hope people enjoy it on Audible. I really do.
A slightly probing question about the book that kind of piqued my curiosity when I read it. What forces were there, do you think, within the federal government that had been introduced to the federal government on many occasions? And I think they probably had it. They had knowledge of the.
Well, they had it for 5 years.
5, yeah, as you said, 5 years. So was it the leaders themselves? Throughout those changes of government?
I think the issue, the bureaucracy was
why the resistance, I suppose.
Well, the bureaucracy was very much against overturning an established immigration policy.
Right, okay.
Okay, and bear in mind Australia's immigration policy. One of the first pieces of legislation that came up before the Australian Parliament in 1901 was the White Australia policy. And so...
there's your baseline.
That's your baseline. That was the baseline.
Yeah.
And so the bureaucracy was very much opposed to it. In addition, there was some evidence that certain security people had concerns about Steinberg because of his links with the Bolsheviks.
I see.
But
he didn't come out with an entourage of 200 or 300, though, did he?
No.
He came out by himself.
He was by himself.
Yeah.
He was by himself. And he
won the hearts and minds.
He won he won the hearts and minds not only of unions but churches, of business people, of judges, people who were not left-wing.
We have a period in the 30s, we have the Nazis coming to power
That's right.
Europe, a rise in anti-Semitism. So we have Jewish people spread across many, many countries. And so this was actually an opportunity during those times in the early 30s to begin a process where these people and communities could live somewhere much more safely and were more than happy to do the work required to establish a settlement.
Think about it. It was a scheme that could have saved lives of people. It was also a scheme, had it been established, it could have changed the world, because would they have set up a state of Israel with a thriving Jewish settlement in the Kimberleys?
That's the other very interesting.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so a lot has pivoted on this period in history.
That's right. So it could have changed. So it could have saved people's lives, and it could have changed the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, and created a very different world from what we know now.
In terms of population density, I mean, Australia's right down in the bottom 5%.
Yes.
I mean, I think currently we're three people per square kilometre.
Yeah.
Whereas Israel is up there in the top 10, I think.
Yes.
But,
well, it's a much smaller land.
At the time that Steinberg was within Australia working with the Freeland League, that there was not an opposing but in some ways complementary group of Jewish folks on the Zionist perspective, which was that there can only be one place where the Jews will live, and that's Palestine.
The fiercest opponents of this scheme to save Jews were the Zionists. They campaigned against it. They opposed it because they felt it would supplant Israel, supplant Palestine.
So Australia would be not only a compromise, but it would actually take Palestine. It would wipe Palestine completely off the agenda
as an option.
So, whereas
because Zionist leaders told me in the course of my research of the book, and they said, "Listen, we knew the British were playing a double game. You know, we knew what they were doing, and we weren't going to play along with that."
Can you unpack that a little bit? What do you mean by a double game? How does that work?
Well, they were playing one side off against the other.
In what respect?
Well, the British would say, "Yes, we want." The British would support a colony
in Palestine.
A colony in Australia, because it would mean they wouldn't have to give up Palestine, which was part of their empire.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It was part of the British Empire.
That's how it works.
And also the other complication for the British was that you had a sizable Arab population in Palestine, and they could see there were going to be a whole lot of issues between the Jewish settlers and the Arabs.
Right.
So,
okay. So this is where the Freelanders were perhaps anticipating those problems with Palestine, saying, well, maybe if we just cast our net a bit wider.
Well, the Freeland League was saying, that's right. The Freeland League was saying, well, there is no established population. Well, there was an established population in terms of the Indigenous population, but back in those days, Indigenous people weren't even classified as citizens.
No, absolutely not.
And so,
that famous early announcement, not long after Cook discovered the place, was that they described it in Latin terms as being terra
nullius,
which means
empty land,
unoccupied, no human habitation.
That's right, no human habitation.
I mean, it's awful, isn't it?
And so the question is, how would the Jewish settlers have worked with the Indigenous people? I suspect they would have done that. They would have been okay as refugees. They would have had sympathy for the Indigenous population. Absolutely. And I suspect they would have worked with them. It's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. Although it never came up in all the papers, in all the documents, in all the interviews, it never came up.
Not a word.
Not a word.
It took until 1967, I think, before Aborigines were recognised on the census. Around about that? Pretty close.
1966. I think it was 1966.
Right. Which is a long way from 1788, really, isn't it? Like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So the Australian government at the time had concerns about about well, they were one of their fundamental concerns was that the Jewish people may have been motivated to duplicate exactly the agenda that was going to happen in Palestine, in Australia, and to form a separate sovereign territory or a separate state. Was that ever a concern, do you think?
It wasn't going to be a separate state because the settlers were saying, listen, it's just a settlement. So it will be culturally autonomous, but it will follow Australian laws.
Yeah.
It will follow Australian laws in education, defence, taxation, everything like that. It won't be a separate state.
I understand.
It will still be part of Western Australia. You know, it's just a colony. That's all, an enclave.
The folks immigrating or refugees from war-torn Europe were not only going to come in under all of these conditions, become Australian citizens, but this wasn't going to cost the Australian government anything. All of the funding for establishing this settlement was going to come from overseas sources.
All of it was going to come from the Freeland League.
Wow.
And the Freeland League said, we will pay for everything. You don't have to do anything at all.
When you're looking at the value of an investment decision, it actually doesn't matter how it's financed. It's really whether it's a good, profitable, sustainable
That's right.
idea. The Australian government probably, if they had any doubts regarding whether it was going to be invested or the extent to which they funded it, they've kind of given themselves away a little bit by saying, we don't actually believe in the business idea.
That's right.
We don't even believe in the economics of the scheme.
That's right. Well, the Australian government was saying our stated aim to not allow group settlements of migrants overrides economic issues.
Right, okay. So this is...
And it overrides social issues of saving people's lives.
I was very moved by the story when I read it and certainly during the recording as it was told as a story. Why is it important to continue to tell this story for the current generation, perhaps for the older generation and perhaps future generations to come?
I think it's a way of opening our minds to immigration and the benefits of immigration and seeing what the possibilities are and seeing how, immigration can actually make a country. Australia is basically a nation of immigrants.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, who walks on this earth or has walked on this earth isn't an immigrant.
That's right.
So we've all moved from somewhere to somewhere else.
That's right. So this is what makes it so important. This is what makes it a quintessentially Australian story.
We've had a brand new member for Parliament in their maiden speech to make all sorts of rather, I would suggest, antiquated remarks regarding immigration and the nature of people's choice regarding religion, that where they come from starts defining who they're going to be in the eyes of...
And it was actually those words of his that precipitated an enormous debate about who we are as a nation. And that's important.
Look, thanks very much for chatting to us, Leon.
Thank you.
That's been a most enjoyable interview. And folks, we'll look forward to giving you more updates and teasing some more information out of Leon's beautifully researched work.
Thank you.